Apparently it's being recorded. So I'm going to run through some slides quickly. It's a bit of a hodgepodge of a slide deck, I confess, because I wanted to answer quite precisely some of the questions that were mentioned in the blurb for this event. So we'll run through those. I'm also going to talk about a couple of tools you might want to use for communicating research. My focus is on communicating research to policymakers, but a lot of the principles I'm going to talk about would apply communicating with any audience at all. My own background is in journalism and then communications more generally, and I take very much a communications approach to SPRE's work and to my own work in the field of what's called policy engagement. So we can get into that a sort of general chat about communications as well. There was one thing I just wanted to share with you. Actually, I was just mentioning to Zoe that this morning I was at the AGM of the Imogen Institute, and for those of you who don't know about Imogen, it's natural scientists and social scientists working together around questions of innovation policy and related matters. And there was just quite an interesting exchange, which I thought I would share with you. Their guest lecturer was Smita Srinivas, who is an interdisciplinary economist attached to the Open University, but based in India. And the first question came from Joyce Tate, who some of you might know. Joyce is a professor at Edinburgh, an incredibly distinguished scholar. You know, she's on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Innovation Policy and Science and all sorts of things. And Joyce was, you know, the kind of, she prefaced her question by, you know, saying that in her own PhD, she didn't really have a disciplinary affiliation, and indeed her undergraduate degree wasn't based in one discipline. And so she had just kind of continued really as a non-disciplinary scholar throughout her entire career. And the speaker was responding and saying how much easier it was because she had gone through the same journey, although she ended up in the economics school. And obviously I knew I was coming here later on, and I just kind of picked up on that fact, the idea that actually disciplinarity is not a natural state of being. You know, if you work in universities, it's really easy to think that it is, that, you know, we are born historians or analytical chemists or whatever it might happen to be, sort of from the cradle on. But actually disciplinarity is imposed upon us. So I think there probably are huge advantages to starting your career with this perspective rather than trying to win it back later on. So I just thought I'd share that sort of very short and not terribly exciting story. But cool, I'm going to run through some slides. I will, if I can make the technology work, just pop out there we go. So if you have any questions as I'm speaking, or if you can't hear me or anything like that, you can either just comment in the chat, which I should still be able to see while I'm looking at the slides. I have this tiny screen, which I've spent the last year and a half saying, oh, I should get a computer with a bigger screen. And it's become slightly a moot point. But if for any reason I don't notice what you're saying in the chat, just unmute yourself and shout out. I'll leave some time for questions at the end. In an ideal world, I would like to be away by 2:30, but if we can't do that, then that's fine. But I just mention that now in case I start looking a bit edgy by you know, it's 2:45. Cool. All right, let me just make the technology work here. So, as I say, my focus is on talking to policymakers. The project I run, the Scottish Policy and Research Exchange, kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. But the principles I'm going to talk about here would apply to communicating with any non-academic audience. And I would argue they also apply to academic audiences as well. It's just academics like to pretend that they don't. Let's just have a quick look. I wanted to mention this guy. I had a very quick look around for someone who wasn't a dead white man, but unsuccessfully, I'm afraid, but I did only look for a few minutes. Matthew Hay is quite interesting. If you don't know about Hay, he was a professor of forensic medicine at Aberdeen University I think in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he had two opposite numbers in Edinburgh and Glasgow as well. And he was also the city's first chief medical officer. And he's interesting because he was a medic, but he recognized that the problem with a lot of what they were doing was the housing that people were living in. And so he played an incredibly important role in sweeping away slum housing in Aberdeen. And he recognized that you couldn't tackle diseases like typhoid and influenza and scarlet fever and so on if people were living in damp, filthy, dangerous housing. So he was an early advocate of combining what's happening in the academy with what's happening in the world beyond its walls, but also of thinking across boundaries. So I just thought he was quite an interesting figure to look at. So there's four quick questions that I'd like you to think about. Now, normally when I talk to groups, I actually spend the whole time talking about these questions. So I'm not really going to get into that so much today because I want to talk about audience. But when you're thinking about engaging with policy, or in fact with any external audience, these are useful things to think about. So what question are you actually answering? It is really tempting to say, here's what my research found. Yes, I'll share a copy of the slides. But think in terms of what is an external audience actually asking. So in a policy setting, you might be looking at the sorts of questions that have been raised in party manifestos or in budgets, or the Scottish Government has a programme for government that it publishes every year. So that would raise certain policy questions. And I'll get into this a bit more as we speak, but it's worth bearing in mind, a policy question and a research question are very different. A policy question, it has to be framed in such a way so as the answers to it can actually be affected in the world. So it can't be, it's not an abstract question. The answers to it need to work in quite an immediate sense. And that, some of that is about applicability in practice, but some of it's also about, will it get past the media? Will it get past that person's own party? How will different actors, maybe different centres of power respond to any such proposal? So it needs to operate in those terms. So the who, and we'll unpick this a lot more today, who do you need to speak to? So before you start thinking in terms of how you're going to speak to them, think about the who. Who is the audience for what you're trying to say? So those first two questions, and you'll see this on, I think, the next slide, we often talk in terms of message and audience. And the clearer you can be about those two things, that will actually answer all the subsequent questions for you in terms of how you go about communicating with someone. But a couple of questions that tend to be sort of immediate issues that come out of that is, how does that person learn? How do they usually acquire knowledge? And why should they be interested in what you have to say? Now, those are two early questions and useful questions because they'll make a whole series of decisions for you. So if you're communicating with a civil servant, for example, they usually learn by reading reports. So they'll be interested in reading usually quite a short report. If you're communicating with a journalist, by contrast, they very rarely read reports. So they're much more likely to notice one piece of information or something on social media and then connect with you directly and have a conversation with you. Yeah, so think about how different audiences learn, what they might be interested in, and what pulls them in. What does this relate to? So rather than saying, oh, our research is very interesting to other scholars, why should this non-scholarly audience be interested at all? So again, that takes you back to your first question. Think in terms of the question they're asking, right? Not the answer that you're giving. So I often talk in terms of people thinking about the policy question rather than the research answer. What's interesting here, let's for a moment assume that we're just talking about one particular study. What is the headline, if you like, for non-academic audiences is routinely not the most interesting bit for academic audiences. Oh, thanks very much. We'll just get that link just now. No. Sorry, can you still see the slides?
Yes.
Yes, cool. All right. I didn't think about it as I happily clicked on the link, but thank you for the link. So yeah, if you think in terms of what their interest is going to be, and it may well not be, as say, the academic headline, it may well be something often considered kind of trivial. So it's useful to think in those terms. Right, let's get into this. I wanted to pick up, this picks up on what we were just talking about. So pick up on the sorts of things that policymakers in particular might be interested in when they look at research. They routinely say, I mean, you know, I lose count of the number of times I hear this, that what they're interested in is overviews of research from a number of different perspectives. They have very, very little interest in kind of academic turf wars. There is some interest around methodology, but I'll talk about that in a later slide. But they generally speaking, they're looking for things that synthesize existing knowledge and to some extent can say, this is what we know. Now that might well be, you know, this is what we know with some confidence, this we think we know, but we're not so sure about. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. What they're not interested in, and increasingly funders are moving in the same direction as well, is having a conversation that runs along the lines of, oh, well, you know, this is what political scientists think, but this is what economists think, and this is what sociologists think, and they're all slightly different because they're all answering slightly different questions. So actually, they're trying to draw together an interdisciplinary perspective on those live policy questions that we were just thinking about. So often when you're approaching an audience that you want to engage with or influence in one way or another, you're thinking first of all about the question from their perspective, and then thinking, well, what knowledge can I draw together from different academic perspectives and then present it in a way that's consumable by that audience. So again, that question of how do they learn? I've already mentioned that the determining characteristic there is that a policy question has an answer that can be applied in the world. But the attention of policymakers can change very quickly. Yeah? So if you were, for example, a researcher working on novel coronaviruses just 18 months ago, you would really have no audience in government at all. I mean, there would be someone somewhere who was working on it, but no particularly great interest. Obviously, a couple of months after that, every government in the world would want to speak to you. So policy questions are live, and when they pop, if you like, there can be a sudden and really great interest in a particular piece of topic, a particular piece of work, and again, they want a broad brush approach to knowledge. And they want to know what do we know with some degree of confidence. That said, there are long-term endemic problems where, again, bringing perspectives from more than one discipline helps reframe those questions. For what's a good example? Why do working class boys do badly at school? Right, is a question that has faced policymakers for decades, and how can that be resolved? Now, the solutions to that have always come from a handful of disciplines. So again, bringing new perspectives and helping policymakers to think about those problems in new ways can actually be quite radical and is quite a good way to engage an audience. You would be surprised what they haven't heard. So that was one of the, as I say, I've got 3 slides that are slightly lurching from one topic to another, but I wanted to address these questions specifically. One of the things that I was asked to talk about is what type of evidence are policymakers interested in. The answer to that question is that there isn't an answer to that question. It varies depending on the situation. It varies depending on the institution you're working with and indeed the individual you're working with. All of that said, I think it is fair to say that politicians can often be a bit naive on this and believe that, you know, as long as you've got a big enough pile of data, that somehow the answer will just magically appear. That is, you know, not in fact true. Generally speaking, we work with officials who tend to be, they're often analysts themselves, they're professional researchers, and so they tend to have a slightly more refined approach to this. Scottish Government, for example, is much more interested in qualitative approaches, in mixed method approaches, and they tend, when they're pulling together teams of experts, they tend to look for interdisciplinary teams. UK government tends to be a bit more obsessed with randomized control trials, but it's certainly, you know, there is no universal in either government, and that would apply to other organizations around the world as well. I think that policy institutions are on a bit of a learning curve at the moment. So there's a new interest in what's termed policy engagement within the academy, or academic engagement within policy institutions. And there's quite a lot of learning going on there. And I think that there is a growing recognition that there are lessons for policymakers to learn from the social and natural sciences. We're getting to the point where some scholarship from the humanities, sometimes from theoretical sciences, is getting adopted as well. But often, you know, there's a journey to be walked there in terms of having the thinking skills at the other end. But generally speaking, and this applies when you're communicating with any audience. I mean, I put it there in the little pull quote, but data plus a narrative is a really effective way of communicating. But we like to think, oh, we're very data driven, we're focused on data, and even evidence more generally, actually. But actually, we're storytellers. You know, humans think in terms of stories, and if you can provide a narrative and then data that supports that narrative, that's hugely influential. Yeah, so not only are you giving me information, but you're also providing me with a narratival tool to help me understand that information, why it matters, and how I might use it. Just before I move on to the next slide, obviously we have a picture of a Kelpie there. When I was putting this slide together, I was kind of struck at how weird it is when you only see one of them. It looks as if something is noticeably missing, as indeed it is, but that has nothing to do with this presentation at all. I just thought I'd mention it. So I wanted to address those 2 questions because I think they're important to this particular challenge of how you communicate interdisciplinary research. This next slide would apply to any type of communication you're ever doing, right? From writing an essay to writing a novel to, scripting a film. I mean, whatever you happen to do, there are three aspects to any form of communication that you would want to think about. So the first of those is the message, which it sounds really straightforward. Yeah, I mean, you say, "Oh, well, that's obvious. I know what I want to say. I've got these findings, or I've got this idea I want to get across." It's not that straightforward at all. You want to, in as far as possible, to boil your message down. It is a good exercise to try and be able to say it in a single sentence. So you want to be absolutely clear about what it is you want your audience to understand. That means not talking around the topic. It means not getting focused on the background or how you reached a particular conclusion, or why you might happen to think it's important. You need an absolutely forensic focus on what it is you are trying to say, for reasons that will become clear. The second aspect of that is audience. So be as precise as possible about who it is you're speaking to. Now, often when I work, for example, with academics that might be helping them set up a blog, just take one example. And I'll say, well, who's the audience for this blog? And the answer I'll get is, oh, well, general public, policymakers, journalists, other scholars. It would be good if they read it. Young people. Oh, actually, industry as well. It's like, no. The purpose here is to make it as narrow as possible, not as broad as possible. Now, other people may engage with whatever communication you're producing, but who are you actually writing it for? If in your head you can get that down to an individual, it's a really useful exercise, because it encourages you to think of, well, how does that person learn? What do they already know? What do I want them to know? How do they, what's their level of expertise in this particular topic? What do I need to explain? What would sound patronizing? So as far as possible, you're trying to define your audience really narrowly. Now, if you want an example of why you might do that, if you're asked the question, what do you do? What's your job? You would explain that very, very differently to a friend, to the child of a friend, to a colleague working in the same broad field. You would give them very, very different answers because your audience has changed. So when you're communicating any type of research, you need to think in terms of, well, who is my audience for this? What do they already know? What is their interest to take away from this? Are they busy? Are they time rich? Right? If you are communicating with time-rich audiences, so I'm sure you will have attended public lectures that I used to go to them in Edinburgh, and you would sort of see retired gentlefolk of Morningside walking down the hill to George Square to attend these lectures with all the time in the world. So you communicate with them very, very differently than you might communicate, for example, with a government official in the middle of handling a crisis. So the way in which you communicate and what you say will be determined by the audience you're speaking to. So these are the two great pillars of any form of communication, message and audience, and you go back between those two over and over again. The more you think about the audience, the more it helps you refine your message. The more you think about what it is you need to say, that helps you reflect on who the audience is and what they need to hear. So the final part of that process then is the medium. And the medium is the bridge between the two. So having worked out what it is you want to say and who it is you're trying to say it to, you can then think in terms of how you might say it. So think, we talk about oh, we should communicate this, as if that's one process. And thinking about it as one process tends to lead, I'm sure you'll seen this with research projects that you're involved with yourself, to people attempting to broadcast on all frequencies. And when they do that, it's usually evidence they haven't thought through those first two questions. Yeah. So if you've been involved in any funding bids, you may be aware that research funding councils have now got rid of what were termed pathways to impact in that initial in those initial funding applications. And it's because everybody wrote the same thing. Yeah, everybody wrote, oh, we will set up a website, have a Twitter account, have a Facebook account, have a social media presence. We will engage with stakeholders to achieve, identify best practice to blah, 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 blah. Everyone said exactly the same thing, and it didn't tell you anything. Right? The objective here is not to try and use every single communication tool there is. It's to try and use the communication tool that will allow you to reach out to your audience most effectively. And I say that requires you to be quite precise. So you don't communicate with MSPs, for example. You work out which MSP it is you need to communicate with. Okay, so a lot of this is the onus. It's actually not hugely time consuming, but the onus is on you to think it through up front, rather than to say, oh well, we'll just stand on the top of a building and shout, and hopefully the right person will hear us. So, what does that mean in practice? This is a very exciting slide. There are lots of communication tools that you might use. I normally remember to update, so there's something with the right university logo on. So sorry, you've got QMU's logo there. There are lots of communication tools you might use, some of which you probably don't even think of as communication tools, right? So email, for example, well, that's just something that is, but it's not. So there are limitations on what you can do with email, and there are things that it's really good at. It is not good at conveying large quantities of information. If you want to communicate more than a couple of paragraphs, really, email is not a good tool. Similarly, the phone is something we don't think of as a communication tool. We think of it as just something that is. Well, it's got real strengths. It gets you through to a precise person. If you are phoning, let's say, a government official or a journalist, you've got the right person. The downside of it is that it's not very good for talking to 50 people. So there are pros and cons to any communication tool. So what are some of the things you might want to think about? So the first thing I would suggest that you think about is not to overcomplicate things. Right? It's often, when people are communicating research, they'll say, oh, we should we should communicate our research through interpretive dance. That would be really imaginative, really original. I think that it's fine, but actually there are standard tools in most circumstances. It's worth using those tools. It's overcomplicating things. People don't like to learn in new ways. Give them things that are familiar. It can be great to use something original to get people's attention, but once you've got it, give them something just simple and straightforward. As I say, all communication tools are a balance between those two things, between message and audience. Yeah? So your ideal tool to communicate your message, it might be a very subtle and complex piece of research that you would want to go into great details for, and the ideal tool there would be a book, perhaps even a series of books. Unfortunately, you're communicating with people who are time poor, so they would prefer it to be in the shape of a couple of bullet points. While the compromise between the two, and we'll look at how you structure this in a moment, the compromise between those two is probably a short report. And now that will mean that you have to leave things out. That's fine. you know, you can provide more detail later on where people are interested. So again, you're thinking about the balance between your needs, the needs of the message, and their needs, the needs of the audience. So I wanted to get into two sort of practical examples of things you might do. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So so just mentioned my internet is acting up a bit, so sorry if I'm drifting in and out. I will circulate these slides, and if there's anything you particularly want to follow up on with me, just drop me an email. My email's at the end of this presentation. So I wanted to talk quickly about two types of communication you might use, just because they make the point more clearly than me trying to explain it. So blogging is an incredibly powerful tool if it's done right. Okay, there is no such thing as a good blog, a good blog post, but it's people need to know where to find it. So you can write the most brilliant thing in the world, but if it's in the wrong place and nobody's looking, then it doesn't really achieve anything. So what you tend to be looking for is to either build or participate in a platform that already has a reputation for consistency. Consistency really is key here. So any audience, so again, the blog platform wants to speak to that audience. A good way of checking that, if they have a related Twitter feed, is to look at who's following them on Twitter. You know, and again, a blog that you might set up for a small group with a professional interest in that particular topic would function in quite a different way. What we term the voice of the blog would be very different to one that was more aimed at a general audience. So often the media will work in that way. It talks about things in often quite imprecise ways, which a general reader doesn't care about, but a professional reader might find really problematic. There's a lovely phrase about communications that the art of any communication is not to always be understood, it is to never be misunderstood. And that distinction really comes into play when you are communicating research, so that people won't understand exactly what you're saying, but they can always ask. The real problem comes when they misunderstand what you said and think you're saying something that you're not. So as I say, consistency is everything. It's really important, and it's what you should look for in any blog you write for. Clarity is also everything. When you're writing for lay audiences in particular, and I'll defer to your expertise here, but I would argue that this is also true in interdisciplinary communication. You should aim to be talking, the phrase we tend to use is the intelligent lay reader. Yeah, so the non-specialist, or in the case of non-academic, they might well have professional specialism in this area. It's just different from yours. But you're talking to somebody who is intelligent. So you are thinking about someone who is, comfortable in their use of language and has an interest in the topic, but they may not be familiar with academic terminology. So consistency and clarity and relevance. This brings us back to that issue of thinking in terms of what is the policy question, or if you're engaging with the media, what they term the hook for the story. So again, what bit of what you're saying is your audience interested in, and speak to that. Often when I look at academic blogs, I follow something like 100 academic blogs, and the number of them that really just talk about, congratulations to our PhD student who's completed their PhD, or congratulations to our director who's become a fellow of this, that, and the other, or great news, we've got funding from such and such an organization. That's great, but frankly, the people who are interested in that can literally, you could stand in your office and shout, and you reach them all. If you're talking to an external audience, they're not interested in any of that. You know, I used to have on one of these slides that, like, if someone's finished their PhD, that's great, tell your dean and your mum, but beyond that, the world outside isn't interested. What they're interested in is research findings and an expert opinion. Either of those will get people's attention. So if you're applying that to the question at hand and to the subject of that particular blog platform that's important here, then you'll have an audience. So the other tool I wanted to mention is what's termed a policy brief. I'll go through this briefly, but policy briefs are a pretty standard way of communicating with policymakers. These are not unrelated to research briefs and evidence briefs. They have a small difference, which I'll mention in a minute. But generally, this kind of an approach can work very well. I say that there are several different types of briefs that you might want to write, but they share a lot of characteristics. They all tend to be fairly short, you know, and they're written in a professional style. This is something, you know, someone is reading as part of their job. So you're writing for another professional, and that's rather different to writing for a general audience where you might be a bit more sort of conversational about it. Policy briefs address a particular policy question, and anything that doesn't relate to that question, you just cut it out. I said I would distinguish between research briefs and policy briefs. So policy briefs make a recommendation, or may well make several recommendations. Research and evidence briefs are far more along the line of this is what we found out, and then you leave it there. And there's all sorts of reasons why you might use one or the other, depending on who you're writing for. But also there's some issues sometimes around, so different funding councils, some will allow you to make policy recommendations and some don't. So just be aware of that. In terms of the evidence you provide and how you use it, the evidence needs to relate to the problem being asked. However interesting other findings may be, if they don't relate to the problem being asked, don't use them, and any conclusions that you draw should tie directly to that evidence. Sounds like it might be an obvious thing. You would be surprised at how often I am sent, you know, I mean, things for parliamentary evidence or evidence briefs for government officials, whatever it may happen to be, and people have said, oh, here's our evidence, this is the research we did, here's the evidence, and here's what I think. And what they think might well be right, but it doesn't relate to the evidence set out. Now, I've mentioned policymakers are often looking for expert opinion, and that's fine, but ground it in evidence, link it to something. So very quickly, what does a policy brief look like? The executive summary, although it's the first thing in any document, is usually the last thing that you would write. So you write the whole of the rest of it first, and then, you know, look at that and say, well, what is it we've said? And then you craft your exec summary based on that. You have an introduction, which will explain why it matters. Again, this varies slightly depending on the audience you're writing for, but you want to create a sense of curiosity if possible. This is quite important, and something that I think we often struggle with when we're writing for people outside the academy. Methodology is important. There should be something in there when you're writing for the audience or other technical audiences. They want to know that this was a robust process, but you're associated with a university, people will assume that that is the case, but they do need to tick this particular box. So explain it, but explain it briefly, and it should not be the main focus of what you're talking about. Often academic publications, the methodology itself is a big deal. That is not the case here. So your results and conclusion should be a big chunk of this. this is really what people are interested in. Often you'll see people just turn straight to the results section of a brief. Take the reader step by step through it and explain each point in an evidence chain. By the time they get to this, if you are making conclusions, they should kind of be, they should know what's coming. Now, I said some funding councils, for example, discourage policy recommendations. What do I mean by that? So if that is the case, you are absolutely at liberty to say walking and cycling are good for public health. If you were then to make recommendations, you would then say, and therefore local authorities should spend money building walkways and cycle paths. Right? So it's that distinction. I mean, once you've established the result, it should be blindingly obvious what the conclusion is. But again, make it explicit, and make it explicit for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's not always as obvious as you might think it is. But secondly, as well, because it makes it much useful, it makes it much easier to quote. So when either formally in another document or also just in discussion, people can say, oh, where it says here that we should do this. And then the final part, references and further resources. I would put in all sorts of things down, like links to blogs and things, as well as just a bibliography. It's not an academic bibliography, so it really is it's suggestions for further reading. You're not being exhaustive. So I wanted to touch on those two approaches to communication. I think they're both quite useful tools. There are many, many others. So, and you may conclude that the communication tool that you're particularly after is, a tweet, is a phone call. They don't have to be terribly formal. But those are two good ones. I thought I'd run through them quickly. A few top tips. I'll actually leave you to read over these. There was one thing I wanted to pick up on, because I know one of the questions was how to present yourself as an interdisciplinary scholar. The first thing I would suggest is don't say the word interdisciplinary. I say disciplinarity is not a natural state. For the most part, beyond the academy, people don't think in those terms. And their assumptions about disciplines are more problematic than they are helpful. I'm not sure who's on the call, but if anyone here who's, for example, an anthropologist, much of the world has a very clear understanding of what anthropologists do, and it's completely wrong. Similarly, economists, everyone knows what an economist does, and largely they're wrong. So there are all sorts of disciplines where it is a problem. The problem with saying that someone is an interdisciplinary scholar, indeed I saw someone described that way in the press just recently, is that nobody knows what it means. So I would use researcher, lecturer, senior lecturer, whatever the job title is, working on this topic. So-and-so who researches this at the University of. So it's getting away from things that are of interest to an academic community towards things that are of interest to a wider community. Again, think about who your audience is. I mean, if your audience is going to understand some significance of that description, then use it. If it's likely to confuse them, then don't. There's a tool you use in editing, professional editors use, where whenever you're not sure about something, the question you ask is, does this help the reader understand? And if it doesn't help the reader understand, you don't do it. And the same would apply here. So does the description help the reader understand, or the viewer, or the listener? And if it doesn't, don't do it. Avoid other jargon too. We've mentioned that. The how will it be used is quite useful just to think about. So if you're submitting evidence to government, even if it has the best and most impactful route imaginable, and it will go to an analyst first of all, who will compress it down a bit. That's the research brief you've just written. Become a one-page briefing, go to a policy team, where it becomes a paragraph in a report, goes to a minister's private office, where the whole thing will become 3 bullet points. And those bullet points will mostly focus on the politics of the issue. So it's worth bearing in mind that, you know, that subtle nuance that you might be putting into your report will get squeezed out in the process. Those last two, I'm going to leave. Maybe we can pick them up in questions, but they both really relate to thinking about how your audience will use what it is you're saying. There's some resources there. I will share this. Do have a look at the website and follow us on Twitter. The website has some quite a lot more resources on this topic, so that might be useful. There we go. So there was a bit of a gallop through both bits of communication theory and bits of policy engagement, so I hope it made some kind of sense. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have, or if there was anything in that talk that wasn't clear and I can usefully clarify.
That's great. I've got a question actually. I'll just pause the recording and then maybe folk can just kind of